right, so we continue our series. Say it with me. Do you remember the title of the series? The Beautiful, Believable Basics. Very good. Now, you might be thinking at the end of this presentation, or probably more correctly about 2/3 of the way through this presentation, well, that's not very basic. Because today's part, third part, is actually going to be quite a bit different, significantly different than what we've had up to this point. Just to remind ourselves of where we've come and where we've going, our presentation today is titled A Beautiful, Believable, what's that word? Man. Where have we come from? Well, part one was a beautiful, believable God. Part two, a beautiful, believable story, conflict, creation, and covenant. We will revisit that next week when we come to part four, a beautiful, believable plan. But today we're in part three, a beautiful, believable man. And I've said this before, but it bears repeating. Something doesn't have to be perfectly proved in order to be, what's the word? Persuasive. So in this series, and frankly, and in life, we're not aiming for proof, we're aiming for persuasion. Right? So the goal is that you come away and say, yeah, that's reasonable. I can see that. Okay? We've got another slide here. Something doesn't have to be conclusive in order to be compelling. Right? You can still have the freedom and the liberty to say, you know what, I'm going to maintain my doubts, I'm going to maintain my reservations, while others of us might say, you know what, for me that's persuasive, for me that's compelling. I like to use the illustration of getting married. Right? For those of us that have fallen in love and that had that falling in love result in a marriage, when you stood at the marriage altar, when I stood at the marriage altar to marry my lovely wife Violetta, April 4th, 1999, I did not know everything there was to know about her. In fact, if you added up the total volume of things there were to know about Violetta, and the amount that I actually knew in the, should I say this, few months that I had known her, the total volume of things would have been, there's many more things about her that I didn't know than that I did. But here's what happened. I took the things that I did know, the experiences that I had, and I saw enough consistency within those things that I trusted with what I didn't yet know. Right? So it wasn't conclusive evidence that Violetta was what I thought she was. Now, over the 18 years, she has borne out that she's everything I hoped she would be and more. Have I been a disappointment, babe? Okay, good. Good. Glad to hear that. Wouldn't want you saying that I was disappointing in public like that. Save that for the private conversations. But here's the point. I knew a little bit, and what I saw was compelling enough, not coercive, not absolutely conclusive, but it was compelling enough to urge me on. And so everybody's going to have a different threshold for believability. In my own case with Violetta, I asked her to marry me after I met her 6 weeks later. Okay, so I met her, and I was like 6 weeks into it. I'm like, how is this girl single? So I asked her to marry me, and to everyone's astonishment, chiefly my own and her father's, she said yes. Right? She said yes. So the evidence, 6 weeks in, you don't have coercive or conclusive evidence that she is what you think she is, but I had compelling evidence. Then a little more difficult question, not what is believability, and we're sort of aiming for a general threshold of believability, and we'll get to that in just a bit, but what is beautiful? And the answer here is very difficult to nail down. Everybody has a little different version of beauty. In fact, if I began this phrase, you all could finish it. Blank is in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And yet I do want to share with you several, and we've already done so, several points that I think we can agree broadly are absolutely beautiful. Now, today's presentation is going to be considerably different from the first two that we've had, a beautiful, believable God and a beautiful, believable story. Today's presentation, a beautiful, believable man, at least for about the first 2/3, is going to feel a little more classroom. It's going to feel a little bit more professorial, and there's reasons for that. The reason is that I feel a kind of imperative, I feel a sort of unction, a requirement to be able to share with you some of the strong evidences that buttress why we as Christians believe the things that we believe. Now, you might be a person in here, I don't want to say simple-minded, that's not what I'm suggesting, but you might be a person of great faith who just sort of says, I think that the Bible can be trusted. I've read the Bible, God spoke to my heart, and I believe it. And I would not want to take anything away from that. I think that in many ways that describes the faith that my wife has. She just is an amazing, devoted, very conscientious person, and some of the books I read wouldn't appeal to her on any level. Maybe you're that person, and that's okay. But in a series, especially a series that's geared toward the 22-year-old, 23-year-old, inquisitive, skeptical, cautious David Asscherick, I'm going to ask some hard-nosed questions, and I'm going to need some answers, right? So we're in the first two parts of the series, we've sort of looked at compelling, beautiful storylines and a God who is good and amazing. Today, especially in the first half to 2/3, we're going to be going into the classroom, and we're going to be asking questions like this. When we address ourselves, first of all, to the believability of Jesus, then we'll get to the beauty of Jesus. The man, of course, that we're speaking about, and a beautiful, believable man, is Jesus. And we're going to ask questions like this. Did Jesus actually exist? Right? Like, that's a nice story that you're telling. It's a beautiful story. It's a persuasive story. But literature is filled with lots of stories, right? So the question is not, is it aesthetically pleasing right now? The question is it true? Is it actually the case that Jesus existed? And then our second question, is the record of Jesus' life, teachings, and death in the New Testament accurate and reliable? So the first bit here is going to feel a little bit classroom, so prepare yourself for that. We'll then turn our attention to the beauty of Jesus. We will address ourselves briefly to the uninventability of Jesus. Can't wait to talk to you about that. And then finally, we're going to ask the question, the imperative question, why did Jesus die? And we'll take that up in greater detail next week. I want to start by giving you 8 historical references. Now, the word for these historical references are called extra-biblical. What extra-biblical means is these are references outside of the Bible. Right? Some people might say, well, how can you put your faith in that book? How can you put your trust in that book? How do you know that the Jesus that's described, especially in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels, how do you know that, number one, that Jesus was who the Gospel writers said he was, and number two, how do you know he existed at all? I mean, this is a really old book describing events that took place a really long time ago. How can we be certain that Jesus existed at all? This is the kind of question to which historians turn their attention when they try to discover historical veracity or historical verifiability, right? And I'm going to give you 8 quotations, all historical quotations, that are the very kinds of questions and quotations that I would have been looking for in my inquiry about the truthfulness of Christianity. Not just the beauty of the story, that's all fine and good, we'll get there, but is it true? Is it true? So the first is from, in fact, the first 3 are from FLAVIUS Josephus in his lengthy series, The Antiquities of the Jews. This is from Book 18, Chapter 3. And this is probably the most controversial, in fact, this is undoubtedly the most controversial of the 8 statements I'll share with you here. And I've actually put in brackets. Basically, scholars divide into 3 categories when it comes to this statement, sometimes called the testimony of Flavius, right? And you basically have scholars that say the whole thing was written by Flavius Josephus. Then you have some that say, well, the kernel of it was written by Flavius Josephus. And then others that say none of it was written by Flavius Josephus. The majority of scholars say either all of it or the kernel of it, much of it. Okay, and it's a minority of scholars that say none of it, that's all a later interpolation, it's all a later addition. Okay, so I've bracketed out the most controversial sections, which do occur in ancient manuscripts as old as the 4th century, but I just want you to get a feel for this extra-biblical account of Jesus. Not Matthew, not Mark, not Luke, not John, not the Bible. This is, in fact, somebody who was not himself a believer in Jesus, writing at the behest of the Romans, and this was his one of the 3 statements we'll look at. He says, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. Of course, that's one of the major statements that's in dispute. We'll keep going. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, Josephus being a Jew, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these things, and 10,000 other wonderful things considering him. Now, there is compelling reason to believe that some of this has been added later, but most scholars believe that the kernel of what's being said here is, in fact, authentically written by Josephus. Now, our purpose here is that it's basically a confirmation. It's a 1st century confirmation. Josephus was a writer and an historian in the 1st century. It's a confirmation of the basic portrait that we have of Jesus in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, let me give you a second one here. The second, he goes on in the next part, also in chapter 3, the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct to this day. Okay, so that's part of the first one. Now we go to chapter 5 of the same book. Now this one doesn't actually mention Jesus as such, but it mentions a very significant person in the life of Jesus, and that's John the Baptist. And as such, it buttresses or corroborates the basic story, the canonical story of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So Josephus writes, now some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly, as a punishment of what he did against, what's that guy's name? John, that was called the Baptist, who of course was the elder cousin of Jesus. For Herod slew him, who was a good man, and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to the righteousness toward one another and piety toward God, and so to come to baptism. So this is the kind of thing that historians see, and they say, oh, this is fascinating, because this is a first century account, a first century corroboration of the basic story that we have, that John the Baptist was in some sense, number one, an actual historical figure, number two, that he had a relationship with Herod, and number three, that he was a preacher of righteousness and a forerunner of Jesus the Messiah. Here's the third and final quotation from Flavius. He says in book 20, chapter 9, after the death of the procurator Festus, when Albinus was about to succeed him, the high priest Ananias considered it a favorable opportunity to assemble the Sanhedrin. He therefore caused James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. By the way, this statement is not in dispute. This statement is widely regarded across a spectrum of scholars as having been authentically written by Josephus. Who was called the Christ. Here he's not saying he was the Christ, as in the first statement, which is questionable, but he's saying people thought he was Messiah. Who was called Christ and several others to appear before this hastily assembled council and pronounced upon them the sentence of death by stoning. Okay, so what we have here are two so far, extra-biblical references to Jesus, and then a reference to John, which significantly corroborates the basic story of Jesus. Josephus continues, all the wise men and strict observers of the law who were at Jerusalem expressed their disapprobation of this act. Some even went to Albinus himself, who had departed to Alexandria, to bring this breach of the law under his observation, and to inform him that Ananias had acted illegally in assembling the Sanhedrin without the Roman authority. So Josephus here is tapping into an event. He's saying, look, this event happened, and it was to bring about the trial of a guy named James, who was the brother of Jesus, who some said was the Christ. First century extra-biblical reference. Significant, very significant. Okay. We turn our attention now away from a Jewish source. We'll return to a Jewish source at the end. Now we go to a Roman source. Cornelius Tacitus, probably the best known historian in Rome. Most of what we know about what you think of when Rome comes to your mind, sort of the gladiator Rome, the classic picture of Rome that you get in your mind, comes to us through the writings of Cornelius Tacitus, who lived, you can see here, AD 54 to 120. So crossing right through the first century. And he writes this. Nero fastened the guilt on a class hated for their abominations called, what are they called? They're called Christians by the populace. Christus, now that's a Latinization of Christ. He would have thought, very likely, Tacitus, this is like his proper name. Of course, the word Christos means Messiah or anointed, same as the Hebrew word Mashiach. But he mistakenly assumes it's a proper name, like David, right? And so he says, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, the name of Christian, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius, a reference, no doubt, to crucifixion, at the hands of Pontius Pilatus. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. The superstition he's alluding to here is the idea that Jesus rose from the dead. He said it broke out in Jerusalem and it made it all the way to Rome. Now, what's great about this is there's really no compelling reason, no real reason that Jesus should have been written about by a Roman historian at all. Jesus spent most of his time in a relatively small regional geographical area. He was not a power player. He was not somebody that would have been known in the halls of learning or the halls of politics. So the fact that he would be mentioned at all is remarkable. And yet here, as with the statements from Josephus, the picture that's painted by Tacitus actually confirms many of the very situations and details that we have in the canonical Gospels. Fascinating. Now we go to another Roman historian, Pliny the Younger, AD 61 to 113. He was a Roman governor, and he writes this, speaking of Christians in his I think he was in, I don't remember exactly where he was the governor, but speaking of Christians in his territory, he's writing a letter to the emperor, I believe. He wrote hundreds of letters, and this letter was to the emperor, and he says, they, Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ, this is key, as to God. What this tells us is that early on in the first century, Jesus was already revered and worshiped as a God by people. They sing a hymn to Christ as to a God and bound themselves by a solemn oath, not to any wicked deeds, but never, what was that oath? Never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. after which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake food. And this is fascinating, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. Now, if you don't know the historical context, you might be surprised for Pliny the Younger to be commenting on the kind of food as being ordinary and innocent. But if you're familiar with the story, what's going on here is that one of the accusations of Christians in the early centuries, especially the first 2 centuries, was that they were cannibals. That they would come together in secret meetings and they would consume flesh and blood, that they would actually eat people. Well, just a question. Were they coming together and in some symbolic sense partaking of the body and blood of Jesus? Yes, but it was assumed, oh, these are cannibals, these people are really dangerous. And so when Pliny the Younger writes, he says, you know, they get up before the sun comes up and they get together and they sing a song to Jesus as God, and then they take a solemn oath not to partake in any wickedness, and then they reassemble and they eat, but not anything nefarious. They just eat ordinary food. Here again, an extra biblical corroboration from somebody who's not a Christian, doesn't have a dog in the race, right? Doesn't have any secret agenda to promote the authenticity of Jesus. Now, the next one's quite fascinating. Mara bar Serapion is Mara, the son of Serapion, a Syriac philosopher. We don't know exactly when he lived, but this letter was written certainly in the 1st century, and most scholars believe sometime around about AD 73. He may be imprisoned or under some kind of house arrest because he's writing the letter to his son, and apparently he's been treated with, injustice, and he's sort of writing a letter to his son saying everything's going to be okay. Right? Everything's going to be okay. I'm being treated unjustly. And he says this, okay? By way of illustration that everything's going to turn out all right, he gives 3 illustrations, 3 people. And he says this: what advantage did the Athenians gain in putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos get from burning Pythagoras? He's asking questions. In a moment, their land was covered with sand. Now watch this. He gives these 2 examples, and then he says, what advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. Now, there is no mention of Jesus or Christ here specifically, but most fair-minded scholars believe that this is an unambiguous or perhaps partially ambiguous reference to Jesus, the wise king after which in AD 70, Jerusalem was destroyed. Notice what it says. It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these 3 wise men. The Athenians died of hunger, the Samians were overwhelmed by the sea, and the Jews, desolate and driven from their own kingdom, right? Clearly a reference to the dispersion, live in complete dispersion, a reference to the post-AD 70 dispersion after the destruction of Jerusalem. But Socrates is not dead. This is fascinating because of Plato. Right? His student. Neither is Pythagoras because of the statue of Juno. And look at what he says about Jesus. Nor is the wise king dead because of the new law he laid down. He lives on in some significant sense, says Mara, son of Serapion, as he's writing to his own son. Lucian of Samosata, AD 125 to 180, so 2nd century here, still very proximal in terms of historical reckoning. A Greek writer says, and he's no fan of Christianity, and notice what he says. The Christians worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who has introduced their novel rites, their new ways of doing things, and was crucified on that account. Oh, fascinating. It was impressed on them by their original lawgiver, a reference to Jesus, that they are all brothers from the moment they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship that crucified sage and live after his laws. Here again, we have corroboration of some of the major points found in the canonical Gospels, that Jesus was crucified and that people continued to follow him even though he was an apparently failed Messiah. Okay, I think I've got maybe 1 or 2 more. Okay, this one now, back to a Jewish source. This is my last one here, the final one on this section. From the Babylonian Talmud, which is basically a bunch of rabbinical writings that were assembled between about AD 70 after the destruction of Jerusalem and AD 500. Okay, this is one of several rabbinical writings that reference Jesus, but this is just one that I'll give you this morning. On the eve of Passover, Yeshu, that's Jesus, on the eve of Passover, Yeshu was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald cried, "He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery," almost certainly a reference to his various miracles, "and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who knows anything in his favor, let him come and plead in his behalf. But," says the rabbi, the unknown rabbi, having not found anything in his favor, they hanged him on the eve of the Passover. Okay, so this is very important for us. These references give us a very strong extra-biblical case, a case outside of Scripture, that says there was a man named Jesus, he did live at this time, many did think he was the Messiah, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. In fact, you can make a very persuasive, again, not a proof-based list, but a very persuasive list of all of the things we would know about Jesus, even if we didn't have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the story that's painted there is a story that is absolutely consistent with the basic story that we have of Jesus in the canonical gospel. Okay? The Gospels. Now, let's turn our attention to the second question here. We can answer the question, did Jesus actually exist, with a resounding yes. The second question is the record of his life, teachings, and death in the New Testament accurate and reliable? This is just another way of asking the question, is the New Testament itself reliable? Is the New Testament, can we go to this book with confidence and certainty and a degree of assurance that this is not just the religious trappings and agendas of people who had something to push, right, who are trying to save face because they followed a Messiah that in fact didn't pan out, and they said, oh, he rose from the dead. Is that what we're dealing with here? Or is there something else going on? Is there a believability and a substance to this thing we call the New Testament? Now, when historians ask themselves questions like, did Jesus exist, and is a certain historical source reliable, they try to address themselves to what is called the criteria for authenticity. Right? Unlike various scientific experiments or mathematical problems, which can be demonstrably proved, I can show you, a science experiment, historians are dealing with a different kind of proof. It doesn't work the same way. What historians do is they look back and they try to establish veracity or authenticity by a series of criteria. Okay, and as they look at those criteria, there are many of them. I want to deal with 4 of them here this morning. We've dealt with some of this before in our study through the Gospel of Matthew about a year ago. But it's good to have a refresher, and there's some new material here as well. The 4 that we're going to address is number 1, what's called dissimilarity, number 2, multiple attestation, number 3, coherence, and number 4, embarrassment. These are 4 of the criteria that professional historians use to try and figure out, did that actually happen? Is that real, or was that just a make-believe story? Let's start with the criteria of dissimilarity. Dissimilarity is just what it sounds like. You're looking for something that doesn't sound exactly like something else. Right? When it comes to dissimilarity, there's actually a bit of a fine line that you have to walk, because the historical source has to be sufficiently similar to what was taking place at the time to be appropriately contextual. In other words, historians will say something like this: is that the kind of story that would have been told at that time by those people in that setting? Right? And if you have something that's radically dissimilar to what's expected by historians who've looked at lots of material from that same age, they'll say, no, it doesn't fit the timetable. Okay, but here's the other problem. If you have something that's so totally dissimilar that it doesn't fit the timetable, doesn't fit the situation, well, then you'd say, well, that's just make-believe. That was written what's called anachronistically, looking back on history and having written something that was supposedly historical. I could give lots of examples of anachronistic works, but time doesn't allow us here. Okay, so when we talk about dissimilarity, what historians are looking for is that it's similar enough to have been situationally, contextually appropriate, but it's dissimilar enough to bring about an awareness. Why would this have been recorded? Why was this recorded at all? And in the case of Jesus, the case is so strong. Okay, let me just give you a few. We have passages like this, Matthew chapter 7, verses 28 and 29, which right at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' first public address, as a rabbi, as Israel's Messiah, Matthew tells you how the people responded to what it is that Jesus said. And so it was when Jesus had ended these things that the people were what? What were they? They were astonished at his teaching. Why? This is key, because he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. That's dissimilarity. That's not like the other teachings that were going on at the time. And we find these points of dissimilarity again and again. Mark chapter 12, verse 17. And Jesus answered and said to them, you probably are familiar with this story, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Jesus answered and said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's. And notice this, the response was they marveled at what he said. Why were they surprised? If what Jesus was saying was consistent with what the other rabbis were teaching, then it would not have been a marvel at all. But there was dissimilarity. Jesus sounds close enough, similar enough to the situation so that it's situationally, chronologically, thematically appropriate, but he's saying something different. They marvel, well, this guy says, render to Caesar, and this is unique with Jesus. Luke chapter 11, verses 37 and 38, Jesus often thwarted the Pharisaical and traditional rabbinical customs of the day, and here's a really good case in point. Many of the Jews were mystified by the way that Jesus behaved, the way that he freely associated with non-Jewish people, the way that he would affirm a Roman centurion and touch a leper. Here's another example of Jesus jettisoning social expectations. And as he spoke, a certain Pharisee asked him to dine with him. So he went in and sat down to eat. When the Pharisee saw it, he marveled that he had not first washed before dinner. Now, this doesn't mean that Jesus practiced bad hygiene. The washing that's being referenced here is a ceremonial washing because you would have become common or polluted in your associations out in the wider world. So here's a similarity with Jesus, but enough of a dissimilarity that historians look at that and say that's likely to have happened. It's one of their criteria. John chapter 4, this is when Jesus comes back after the disciples have gone away into town to buy food, and they find Jesus speaking to a woman at the well, the well-known story of the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. When the disciples come back, it says, at this point his disciples came and they marveled that he talked with a woman, yet no one said, what do you seek, or why are you talking with her? Jesus here is jettisoning social custom and social expectation. Dissimilarity. John chapter 7, verses 14 to 16. Now about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and he taught, and the Jews marveled, saying, how does this man know letters? How does he know so much, having never studied? He hasn't gone to one of our universities. How is he so aware of Torah and of Scripture? Jesus answered and said to them, my doctrine is not mine, but him who sent me. Dissimilarity, not like the rabbis, but sufficiently enough so as to fit into the historical situational context. In that same chapter, John chapter 7, this is a great one. Then the officers came to the chief priests and Pharisees, who said to them, why have you not brought him? They sent these officers out to arrest Jesus, and this is fascinating. The officers answered those that had commissioned them to arrest Jesus, and they said, no man ever spoke like this man. He speaks different. We've never heard anybody talk like this. Principle of dissimilarity. What I call, and we'll get to this, the uninventability of Jesus. Then the Pharisees answered them, are you also deceived? Have any of the rulers or the Pharisees believed in him? And so we see this again and again. I think I gave you 6 or 7 references there, but there are so many references that could be pointed to where Jesus is situationally appropriate, he's contextually appropriate. It cannot be denied that these writings come from a first century, right? We've already established that fairly strongly. But the way that Jesus conducts himself is the kind of thing that people would have taken notice. Why isn't he washing his hands? Why is he talking to that woman? Why is he saying render unto Caesar's? It's the kind of thing you wouldn't invent. You wouldn't make up. You wouldn't write. He's sufficiently dissimilar, and that's where a modern historian will say, that sounds like it carries truth. In their book, Reinventing Jesus, which is a book I'd read before, but I went back and revisited it this week, KOMOSZEWSKI, SAWYER, and WALLACE write these words. The Gospels present Jesus as claiming to be more than merely a prophet, more than a sage, more than a storyteller. His actions as well as his words show him coming perilously close to claiming to be divine. The Judaism of Jesus' day certainly would have had an aversion to this, and they did. But would the first Christians readily accept the divinity of Jesus? Since the first Christians were Jews, they too would have had the same problems with this idea as would have the rest of their Jewish culture. To the extent that the Gospels are rooted in Palestinian soil, notice this statement here, the criterion of dissimilarity reveals Jesus to be more than a mere man. This criterion is one of the probes that historians use, and they say, you know what? That smells correct. That smells right. That looks right. That stands the test of historical authenticity. William SCHUTTER, a theologian, writes, the incarnation first scandalized the Jews because it threatened their commitment to radical monotheism, one God. Christian Jews, like Paul or John, had to wrestle with the possibility that they were compromising their faith, right? Because if there's one God and Jesus is God and Jesus is praying to God, they had to wrestle through that. What is more, the doctrine surely represented an obstacle in the church's mission to Judaism. Hence, the Jewish leadership of the infant church had to have very deep convictions about the incarnation, or they would have abandoned it. They would have had to have been roundly persuaded about the deity of Jesus, or they would have easily abandoned it, because it was so dissimilar to the Jewish expectation. There was almost no expectation that the Messiah would be divine, that the Messiah would be the Son of God. There certainly was expectation of a Messiah. We'll get to that in a moment. But what you have there is sufficient similarity, but also serious dissimilarity that raises the, I don't want to say the specter, it raises the flag to a historian. Hey, that sounds about right. Richard Bauckham, in his book, God Crucified, says it very simply. The earliest Christology was already the highest Christology. What that says is the idea that Jesus was divine and he was the Son of God is not something that was invented by Constantine in the 4th century. You'll sometimes hear that critique. If you saw the movie years ago, The Da Vinci Code, this was the claim in the Da Vinci Code, right? That Jesus was just a storyteller. He was a sage. He was a, provocative young rabbi, but he certainly was not God, and he didn't make any claim to be God. That was a later invention. 4th century, the idea was invented that Jesus was in some sense divine. And what Bauckham says here is, no, not so. The earliest documents that we have about early primitive Christianity, we're talking 1st century Christianity, he says they already had this high Christology, this high view that Jesus was in fact divine and verily the Son of God. So, the criterion of dissimilarity. The next one, multiple attestation, is just what it sounds like. The more sources, the more independent sources that you have for a given story, the credibility goes up, especially if there is, number 3, coherence between those sources. So briefly, when it comes to multiple attestation, N.T. Wright, in his amazing book, The Challenge of Jesus, which I'd read before but revisited again this week, says, all the signs are that the earliest Christians very quickly came to the startling conclusion that they were under obligation, somehow without ceasing to be Jewish monotheists, to worship Jesus. To worship Jesus. The evidence for this phenomenon that I am describing, says Wright, is very early, very solid, and quite unambiguous. This is not some Constantinian invention. It's not some 3rd or 4th or 5th century invention. He says, trust me on this one. This is early, strong, and unambiguous evidence. And part of what he means when he says the evidence is strong is you have multiple attestation, both intra and extra biblical. We've already seen that. We just read a moment ago some of those extra biblical references. They come together, they sing a hymn to Christ as to God. That's a 1st century reference. That's a 1st century reference. Number 3 is the topic of coherence, or the criterion of coherence. Does this, it comes from the Latin word cohere, to stick together. Does the story add up? Does the story work, right? Does it all fit together, or are there outliers in the story? Back to N.T. Wright, again, The Challenge of Jesus. And the people whom ordinary Christians meet, people like you and myself, to whom they must address the gospel, have been told over, and I love this statement, over and over by the media, on the basis of some recent book or other, that the Jesus of the Gospels is historically incredible. That means non-reliable, non-credible. And that Christianity is therefore based on a mistake. It simply will not do to declare this question out of bounds and to say to those inquirers that the church's teaching will do for us, thank you very much, so we do not need to ask these historical questions. That's what I would have said as a 22, 23-year-old inquirer. If you would have said to me, well, that's what the church teaches, or that's what the Bible said, I would have been unmoved by that. I would have said, show me the money. Where's the data? Where is the actual data that can corroborate or substantiate that Jesus was who he claimed to be? Wright continues, you cannot say to a serious and inquiring person who engages you in a conversation on a train, or to someone who wanders into a church one Sunday and asks what this is all about. They're asking serious questions. He says they need serious answers. If Christianity is not rooted in things that, what are those next 2 words? In things that what? Actually happened when? Actually happened when? In 1st century where? Palestine. I love this statement. If Christianity is not rooted in things that actually happened in 1st century Palestine, we might as well be Buddhists, Marxists, or almost anything else. If it's just a nice story, well then let's follow the Buddhist nice story. Or he says, why be a Christian? Because Christianity is an historical faith, a faith that is grounded and rooted in events, historical events having actually happened, surrounding the life of a man that actually lived in actual place at an actual time. Wright continues, if Jesus never existed, that's the first question to which we addressed ourselves, or if he was quite different from what the Gospels and the church's worship affirms him to have been, then we are indeed living in cloud cuckoo land. He says if the story that's painted in the Gospels and the story that's being painted by the worship of the church is different from reality, then we're just addressing it's a joke. We're just living in some make-believe world. And I love what he says, the skeptics can and must be answered. There are good answers to these questions, and so not only multiple attestation, but coherence. The picture that we find of Jesus in the Gospels and in the extra-biblical references cohere together. It sticks together, sounds the same, looks the same, and you've all heard the old saying, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, waddles like a duck, it's a duck. Right? The story that comes together looks like the same Jesus. You don't have this outlier like, whoa, what's going on there? What's this Jesus over here doing? If you have read through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you have had that impressed upon your mind. This is the same guy, written about from different people, different perspectives, different styles. No one doubts that. Then you get, of course, Paul in the New Testament epistles writing about Jesus. But the picture of Jesus, the portrait of Jesus that's painted is absolutely coherent. And then finally, this is a fascinating one that we touched on in this church before, and that's what's called the criterion of embarrassment. Embarrassment. Embarrassment is when writers, historical writers, record things that could have been potentially embarrassing or compromising to the cause or the person that's being advocated. And the Bible is filled with these, both Old and New Testaments, but we'll stick with the New Testament here this morning. Mark chapter 13, verse 32, of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. If you were making this story up and just putting words into an imaginary Messiah's mouth, you would not have your imaginary Messiah saying that he was limited in some sense of power or knowledge. Right? A historian will look at that and say, you know what? That is potentially embarrassing. Like, what do you mean Jesus doesn't know? Isn't he God? And so an historian will say, when you have something that's recorded that's potentially embarrassing or potentially compromising, that is likely true. And there are many, many of these. I'll just give you a quick list of about 10 of them. Jesus' humble beginnings is not a story that you would have made up if you were trying to advertise a Messiah that was going to save Israel. Jesus' dubious birth, that's not a story you would have made up, right? Because there were questions about the nature of the birth, and that actually comes out in the Gospels. You wouldn't have had Jesus being baptized by John because John in the story is the inferior. You wouldn't have the superior Messiah coming to the forerunner of the Messiah and asking to be baptized. You would have left that out. You wouldn't have recorded story after story after story and situation after situation where the disciples are unbelieving and just generally dull. The disciples are wrangling for position, who's going to be the greatest. You wouldn't have recorded, you wouldn't have made Jesus' disciples look like such knuckleheads, right? If you really want to paint him out to be a great Messiah, it looks like he wasn't doing a very good job in instilling the principles of his kingdom into his disciples. It's not that he wasn't doing a good job, it's just that they were not busy only learning things, they were busy unlearning things. You wouldn't have made up the story of Jesus' rejection by the Jewish leaders. You wouldn't have made up the story that a Messiah gets crucified. We'll come to that at the end. You wouldn't have made up the story of Peter, who was one of the senior apostles. You wouldn't have made up a story of him denying Jesus or the disciples abandoning Jesus, and you wouldn't have had women discovering the tomb empty. All four of the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, record women as discovering the tomb empty, which raises serious points of embarrassment in a first century text because women were not considered as credible witnesses in that context. So Luke chapter 24, verse 11 in the NET says, but these words seemed, the words of the women saying that the tomb was empty, seemed like pure nonsense to them, and they did not believe them. When the disciples didn't believe the words of the women, they were only falling in line with what would have been expected in that, first of all, people don't rise from the dead, and second of all, if women say that somebody rise from the dead, it certainly did not happen. Right? And so the criterion of embarrassment says you wouldn't record that. If you were going to make up a story, you would have men finding it. Credible men, upstanding men. Right? And so by these criteria, dissimilarity, multiple attestation, coherence, and embarrassment, there is very, very good reason, hugely persuasive reason to believe that the record that we have of Jesus in the Gospels is, in fact, accurate, historically accurate and true. Which is our question. Is the record of the life, teachings, and death of Jesus in the New Testament accurate and reliable? And here's just a quick comparison that I'm throwing up here for you to compare historical documents, okay? So what you have here on the left are the histories of a number of well-known historians, ancient historians. So you have Livy, Tacitus, Suetonius, Thucydides, Herodotus, and the New Testament. Then on the second column, you have the date of their oldest surviving manuscript, okay, so, that we have discovered so far. So you have Livy, who was a first century historian. You have 4th century Tacitus, the earliest documents, 9th century. The oldest document, rather, is the 9th century Suetonius, the 9th century Thucydides, 1st century Herodotus. Thucydides and Herodotus are Greek historians, 1st centuries. And then you have the number of what is called extant or surviving manuscripts. How many manuscripts do we have to corroborate that this person actually wrote this? So in the case of Livy, you have 27 existing manuscripts. Tacitus 3, Suetonius 200, Thucydides 20, Herodotus 75. Now I want you to take a look at the New Testament and tell me which one of these numbers stands out at you. First of all, you have the New Testament documents, the oldest manuscripts, the oldest parchments and pieces that we have of the New Testament date back to as early as AD 100 to 150. Now, that's astonishingly early. We do not have copies of the original documents that were written by Matthew or Mark or Luke or John or Paul. We don't have those. Those are what are called the autographs. What we have are copies of those. In fact, more likely, copies of copies of copies, right? These manuscripts, right? But here's the point. What is the number of extant manuscripts, of Greek manuscripts only? It's approaching 6,000, and they're discovering more every year. Now, just by way of comparison, you have massive attestation when it comes to the leverage, the historical leverage, just in terms of the number of copies, but not just the number of copies, the quality of copies. Back to the book Reinventing Jesus. KOMOSZEWSKI, SAWYER, and WALLACE write, the New Testament is far and away the best attested work of Greek or Latin literature in the ancient world. All told, the New Testament is represented by approximately 1,000 times as many manuscripts as the average classical author's writings. Can you say amen? Besides the Greek manuscripts, there are Latin. There are over 10,000 Latin manuscripts. Then you have Coptic, Syriac, Armenian, Gothic, Georgian, Arabic, and many other versions of the New Testament, which are an additional approximately 9,000 extant manuscripts. So you have approaching 6,000 Greek, 10,000 Latin, and about approaching 10,000, just over 9,000 other languages. Okay, there's just nothing approaching that in terms of ancient historical attestation for an historical document. F. Bruce, in his book, The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? Great little book. I recommend it to everybody. You should read it. It's about 140 pages. You should read it if you're a follower of Jesus. He says there is no body of ancient literature in the world which enjoys such a wealth of good textual attestation as the New Testament. Nothing. And then he says, I love this. The evidence for our New Testament writings is ever so much greater than the evidence for many writings of the classical writers, the authenticity of which no one dreams of questioning. Are you with me on this? So when we say to somebody, Jesus did this, Jesus did that, Jesus rose from the dead, Jesus raised Lazarus, somebody says, well, how do you know that happened? Well, how do we know that anything in history happened? By the various standards of embarrassment and coherence and multiple attestation, all of the criterion, what professional historians and scholars are saying to us is we have better attestation for the Greek New Testament, for the New Testament full stop, than we have of any other book of antiquity. Nothing else even comes close. Back to I'll skip that one. Believability of Jesus. Did Jesus actually exist? Is the record of his life, teachings, and death in the New Testament accurate and reliable? The answer is yes. We turn our attention now to the question of the beauty of Jesus. Now, we're going to take this up in much greater detail next week when we turn our attention to a beautiful, believable plan. But we would be remiss, even in the time that we have remaining here, if we didn't sort of address ourselves to the question of, okay, so what? So what? Whenever I deliver a sermon, I try to follow the basic rubric. What? So what? Now what? Right? What is the content? So what is why does it matter? And now what is what do I do about it? What? So what? Now what? Okay? So let's address our attention to the so what? Who was Jesus? What's the big deal about Jesus? What made him so special at all? And I like to describe the first one as what I call the uninventability of Jesus. And a big shout out to Rochelle Chapman for helping me to spell this word that is not actually a word. We made it up. I made it up, and she went along with the ride. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, we find passages like this. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. Paul writes, we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the ages for our glory, which none of the rulers of this age knew. This is key. For if they had known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. No one would have told the story like this. Jesus showed up, in the words of C.S. Lewis, as it were, in disguise. This is not the story that you would have told in that context, in that time. This is not the Messiah story that you would have told. And Paul here says, well, it's because God had his wisdom wrapped in a mystery. Wrapped in a mystery, same book, the chapter before. Paul says the message of the cross, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 to 25, is foolishness to those who are perishing. It sounds absurd. A crucified Messiah, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. And then he quotes the Old Testament prophet, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. I will turn to nothing the understanding of the prudent. Where is the wise? He calls out almost as in rhetorical, combative invitation. He's inviting debate. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer or the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God. All the smart people missed it. They'd been missing God for generations. Well, how did God reveal himself then? It pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. What message? The message of God on a cross. A foolish, mysterious, wild, woolly, unimaginable, uninventable message. For Jews request a sign and Greeks seek after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. Those two words together in juxtaposition, Christ crucified, are crazy words together. It's like square circle. Square circle, you can't talk about a square circle because they're mutually exclusive geometrical figures, right? A square has 4 equal sides and 4 right angles. And a circle, every point on the line is equidistant from the center. You either have a square or you have a circle. You don't have a squircle, right? There's no such thing as a combination of the two. Similarly, crucified means you lost. You were nailed to a tree. You were stripped naked. You were humiliated. You were embarrassed. And the word Christ or Mashiach or Messiah means you're victorious. You were a deliverer. You succeeded. So that's no wonder it sounds like foolishness. We preach Christ crucified. We preach a square circle. To the Jews, it's a stumbling block. The Greek word there literally is a scandalon. The idea that a Messiah would be crucified is a scandal. It's absurd. It's a square circle. It's a wet desert and a dry ocean. To the Greeks, foolishness, but to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. See, this is the story that no one would have invented. History is filled with stories of men who thought or sought to become God, but what about the story where a God becomes a man, and not just a man in any ordinary sense, but God becomes a man and then allows himself voluntarily to be nailed to a Roman instrument of torture? No one would write that story, and if you did write that story, this is key. If you did write that story, you certainly wouldn't have said that was your Messiah. You wouldn't have said that was your God. Can you imagine leading with that? Please come and follow me and my powerful God who was nailed to a Roman instrument of torture. Paul says, I know what this sounds like. When we tell it to the Jews, they think that's a scandal. And when we tell it to the Greeks, they say, your God lost. And he says, yet nevertheless, we preach Christ and him crucified. We don't back down because the foolishness of God is wiser than men. And the weakness of God is stronger than men. Ooh, just let that settle into your soul. The weakness of God is stronger than men. Where was the weakness of God seen? When God allowed, quite counterintuitively, quite foolishly, allowed himself to be nailed to a Roman cross. And he says, but where God looked to be his weakest and where he looked to be his most defeated, the weakness of God is stronger than men. Man, God turned the whole story upside down because you might be thinking, well, this isn't such an extraordinary story. I could have written that story. The reason that you think you could write the story is you've heard it before. You've heard the story before, so you have what's called a referent. You have a context, but no first century Jew would have written this story, and that's the point. That's the point that historians look at, and they say, man, the criterion of similarity, there is sufficient reason to see that Jesus fits the context, fits the times, fits the language, fits the situation, but no first century Jew would have written that story. Which then raises the question, why was that story written? If it's uninventable, unimaginable story, the reason it was written is because it happened. It actually happened. It is the gospel truth, as they say. I love Paul's language here. Oh man, N.T. Wright, I love this quotation. There is no form of early Christianity known to us. We don't know about any early forms of Christianity, though there are some that have been invented by ingenious scholars after the fact, that does not affirm at its heart that after Jesus' shameful death, God raised him to life again. That is not a Constantinian invention. That's not a 2nd, 3rd, or 4th, or 5th century invention. He says we don't know of any version of Christianity in which the story isn't the same. Jesus, the Messiah, the square, was crucified, became a circle, and rose from the dead. Every version, every point of access that we have to primitive Christianity, he says it's always the same story. Already by the time of Paul, our earliest written witness, the resurrection of Jesus, was not just this like single detached article of faith that was bolted on to the outside of first century Judaism. He says, no, the resurrection is woven into the very structure of Christian life and thought. When he says structure, he's talking about communion and baptism. They were doing baptism and communion in the first century. The idea of resurrection was at the very beginnings. There's no legendary embellishment here, says Wright. The uninventability of Jesus is a story that no one would have written if they could. And if they could have written it, they wouldn't have written it. They were all waiting for the expectation, the prevailing expectation, even though there were variations on a theme as to exactly what Messiah would do. The general thrust was Messiah will come, show up, he will restore temple, and he will conquer pagans. Okay, now you ask yourself the question. This is fascinating. He will conquer an enemy. So let's just sort of broaden that. Restore the temple, conquer the enemy. And let's just sort of broaden that. If you would have asked most first century Jews, did that guy right there who's nailed to a Roman cross do those two things? The answer would have been obviously no. Because the Romans were still coercively powerful over the Jews, right? And the temple, even though it existed and even though the sacrificial services were going on, it was still under the jurisdiction of Rome. And so people would have answered, the headlines would have read, Messiah unsuccessful. But the whole point that the first century church began to say was, in fact, Jesus did restore the temple. Now, this is a bigger story that I can't get into right now. He established a new temple. He established himself as the temple, which is why he said, get this stuff out of here. You've made my father's house a den of thieves. And they're like, what? What do you mean? And then he said, destroy this temple and I'll raise it up in 3 days. And they're like, what are you talking about, raise it up in 3 days? It took 46 years to build this temple. Jesus is reestablishing, reconstituting what the temple means, number one. Number two, he did conquer the enemy, but not the enemy of the Romans. He conquered the enemy of sin and of death by implanting the principle of the kingdom of heaven inside of human hearts. Amen? So you have this total inversion of the story, but it's actually not an inversion of the story. It's just telling the story through the wider lens, not the nationalistic hopes of first century Judaism, who, in fairness to them, had been beaten down by the Egyptians and beaten down by the Greeks and beaten down by the Romans and beaten down by the Babylonians. They were looking for a national, political, military deliverer. And so, in a sense, you can see why they reasonably rejected Jesus. I mean, if it's a Messiah and he's nailed to a cross, he's not a very good Messiah. But when you pan out, when you zoom out and you look at the story that's actually being told, whoa, he did reinstitute, reconstitute, and reconfigure the temple. He is the temple. By the way, just quickly on that, I don't have a lot of time. The temple is the place where you go to meet God. That's why he's the temple. He's the place where you go to meet God. He reconstitutes the temple, not as a brick and mortar and marble and gold and timber structure. He reconstitutes it as a flesh and blood incarnational structure himself. That's why he could say, come to me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Come, this is where you meet with God. You meet with God at my feet. You meet with God at my table. What Jesus is doing is he's defederalizing the way that you go to God. He's basically saying, no, I can be in Galilee, I can be in Jericho, I can be here, I can be there. The temple of God is now mobile, it's accessible. And he did conquer death. He did conquer the enemy, but not the enemy of the hated Roman pagans. He conquered a very different and very more important enemy. He conquered the enemy of death. Quickly, why did Jesus die? Well, the short answer is that he volunteered to die. You can say that, did the Romans kill Jesus? You can say yes, but that's a very small part of the story. You could say, did the Jewish leadership kill Jesus? You could say yes, but that's a small part of the story. The truth is that Jesus laid down his own life. He was verily God, and he could have extricated himself from any situation. No one takes my life from me. I lay it down myself, he said in John chapter 10, verse 18. I love this. N.T. Wright, it is unlikely that followers of a crucified would-be Messiah would regard such a person as the true Messiah. Jesus did not rebuild the temple. He had not only not defeated the Romans, he died at their hands in the manner of a failed revolutionary leader. Israel was not rescued. Pagan injustice still ruled the world. However, the belief that Jesus was the true Messiah is deeply and ineradicably embedded in the very earliest Christianity. Right at the outset of this new faith was this idea that Jesus is in some significant sense King and God. And I love Pilate's exclamation when Jesus says, when he asked Jesus, are you a king? And he says, you say so. And Pilate says, then you are a king. Because the Roman governors and procurators were in a continual state of paranoia that somebody would be launching some sort of a riot or some sort of a rebellion or an overture to try to lash out of the throne, especially in the tinderbox that was first century Palestine. And so he's trying to suss out, is this Jesus guy a threat? He doesn't seem like a threat. He doesn't behave like a threat. He's not carrying on, and he's just silent like a lamb before its slaughter. And so when the question and the dialogue takes place, that marvelous dialogue in John 18, Pilate says, you are a king then. And I love Jesus' response. You say rightly that I am a king. You're correct. I am a king, but I rule from the strangest of thrones. I rule from a wooden cross. What is a king doing voluntarily dying on a cross? That's what Jesus said to Pilate. When Pilate said, don't play smart with me, young man. Don't you know who I am? Don't you know I can crucify you? Don't you know I can do stuff to you? And Jesus is like, don't you know who I am? You would have no power if I hadn't decided in eternity past that you can do what you're doing right now. You got no power. Which, of course, would raise the question, if you are not just the King of the Jews, but the King of the world, why are you about ready to voluntarily go to a cross? What is God doing voluntarily dying on a cross? And this is my final quotation from N.T. Wright. My proposal is not that we know what the word God means. Yeah, we already know what the word God means. Every one of us in this room knows. Look at what Wright says, be careful, be careful. My proposal is not that we already know what the word God means and we manage somehow to fit Jesus into that definition. Instead, I suggest that we think historically about a young Jew possessed of a desperately risky, indeed apparently crazy vocation, riding into Jerusalem in tears, denouncing the temple and dying on a Roman cross, and that we somehow allow our meaning for the word God to be recentered on that point. We don't retroactively try to fit Jesus into the version of God. We say, if that's what God is and that's what God does, well then God is awesome. Because his strength is demonstrated in an act of what can only be perceived as total weakness. Total weakness. And yet, we have learned that we are learning there is a new kind of power. A young 22, 23-year-old David, and for those of you that are here, there's a different kind of power. It's not a power of strength. It's not a power of might. It's not a power of biceps or of weapons or of ICBM missiles. It's a totally different kind of power. It's a power of love. It's a power when you're the most vulnerable, when you are the most serving, you are actually the most powerful. God is love. What is God doing, dying voluntarily on a cross? That's an easily answered question. He is being himself. This is not who God isn't. This is who God is. It wasn't like just a little antecedent to the story, a little, a side track to the story. It's like, oh yeah, by the way, God became a man and he died. No, that is the story. That is the God of Jesus. That is the God that Jesus came to represent, and it's the God that Jesus was. What is a God doing on a cross? Is he impotent? Is he powerless? No, he's being himself. Because this is not a God who is defined primarily by the size of his biceps, but by the size and the beauty of his heart. Jesus himself had put it this way, greater love has no one than this, that a man would lay down his life for his friends. And my friends, I want to tell you, that is a beautiful, believable man. Can you say amen? That's not just beautiful. That is a beautiful, believable man. And you do not have to strain the bounds of credibility and of credulity to believe that Jesus was who the Gospels say, that he did what the Gospels say he did, and that he was nailed to a Roman cross. Why? Not because he was a failed Messiah, but because he was in fact the true Messiah. The representative, the Son, God himself on earth. That's a God that I can worship. That's a God that I can love. How about you? Amen. Father in heaven,